We kinda need a revolution. Welcome to a special edition of the Club of Rome podcast, exploring how we can work together across generations, across cultures, across regions, to mobilize action for a regenerative future. A podcast about how to drive meaningful change when the only response seems to be, we kinda need a revolution. I am Nolita Mvunelo, Program Manager of the Club of Rome, and in this episode, I had a chance to speak to Aya Chebbi from Tunisia about women and silencing the guns. Aya was the first African Union Youth Envoy and founder of NalaFem Collective. Thank you for joining us today, Aya. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us. You were the first African Union Youth Envoy, and a sizable part of your work focused on the theme silencing the guns. Today, you lead NalaFem, one of Africa's largest multi-generational alliances of women and politicians and activists united towards transformative feminist change. Has there been a shift in thematic focus from silencing the guns to, transformative change from women? And if so, what inspired that shift?
Thank you so much, Nolita. No, there hasn't been. I think for me, gender justice issues are intersectional issues. When I launched NalaFem, it was guided by Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 manifesto, which we convened at the African Union, 6 consultations, 6 regions of Africa, and they came up with 10 demands. And part of those demands are silencing the guns, sexual reproductive health rights, economic justice, digital justice, and so on. So NalaFem is taking that manifesto to member states to ensure the implementation and the accountability of these demands to go to the ground and trickle down to women and girls in conflict settings, in rural areas, in displaced areas. So it definitely hasn't shifted. I think it deepened because now I'm focused on looking at peace and security from a feminist lens. I'm looking at peace and security from where are the young women at the table of negotiation. But I think also part of the problem in women, peace and security, youth peace and security is looking at these issues in silos and not looking at them as intersectional issues that have to address health and education and employment and all the other issues that we talk about.
In your work of trying to get member states to adopt some of the work and the policies, what has been like the most surprising thing that you did not expect to happen?
Well, after being in this space for over 15 years, I'm not surprised anymore of a lot of the member states' attitudes towards women and young women in leadership. For me, the double standard, the contradictions of how member states behave remain my biggest surprise, even though some of the countries is just not surprising anymore. Like they have a track record of that's how they deal with issues in silos. I think particularly for Africa, this is really globally, at different levels, especially Africa, Europe dynamics. But particularly in Africa, I think after over decades advocating for youth participation and especially young women and still hearing the rhetoric of demographic dividend, but not seeing it on the ground, hearing the rhetoric of youth as a force of change, but not seeing young people appointed to leadership positions, hearing the rhetoric of, women at the table, but we look at Senegal recent election and we don't find any single woman in the cabinet. We look at all the recent election and it's, a lot of old men holding space or even younger men now holding space in Chad, the recent election, a 40-year-old. But then you look at society, you look at the leadership spectrum, you don't see women and youth. And so that's also contradiction is still surprising to me because I think we passed the stage of saying why youth should be co-leading the space, why, women and young women should be in these spaces. I think we all agree on why. So why are we not moving to implementation?
That's such a good point because I remember when I first learned of you and your position at the AU, I was like, oh my gosh, this is such a big moment, right? A young woman in such a high level position. But to your point, it's that like very rarely does it trickle down back into leadership at different spheres. And there seems to be a resistance. How can young people contribute to driving forth that cause that you were such an emblematic moment of?
I'm quite frustrated because young people have done a incredible mobilization, have taken a lot of risks since 2010, 2011 revolutions, from Tunisia to Libya to Senegal to Sudan to Algeria to Burkina Faso, So I think there is a lot of, like, always demand from youth, whether it's democracy or the climate movement or whatever cause is, the decision makers who are predominantly male and old, they always expect youth to call on or to champion or to, drive the change. But at the same time being really intimidated by these youth who are demanding change. So you want youth to demand change, and then when they go on the streets, you're ready with tear gas and arrest and deportation or whatever it is. So I think there is predominantly a fundamental question of how the African state relation with its youthful population that needs to be addressed. Because now that we're having, let's say, more young people in the system, whether it's head of state, we had two at least this year elected in their 40s, or members of parliament, we don't see the system changing. So it's not just now a generational issue, it's also a system-based issue. And these institutional systems, they're post-colonial systems that were built on a certain legacy, and that they do not speak to the youth population aspirations. The way they're structured, they do not speak to the citizenship, which is predominantly young, the youngest in the world. And I think that's where we should really put our efforts in, our analysis in, to address the root cause of this. We're pretty much focused on what's going on very politically on the political level, but we're not looking at systems change. Because even if you put massively right now young people in the system, if the system is failing, it's not going to work. You're going to set up this generation to failure as well. And I think we need that incremental change in reforming the system and making it respond to the aspiration of this century and the next century for it to make sense. From NalaFem side, what we're trying to do is to really prepare this generation when they take on the system, because we know this is an army of women we're building to take charge of the continent, but we don't want them to perpetuate the same practices, the same norms, the same system, the same policies. We want to make sure that, first of all, they all know each other, they all understand where they come from and their stories and their contexts. So when they're all at the same level of leadership, change can be accelerated. If you look at the whole of the African Union and you find more than 50% of these leaders actually understand where we're all going, actually not disputing these small, self-interest debates, and know where we should be going, those policies will pass very fast. And I think that's when you need that army to take charge with the same values, the same understanding of the future, the same aspirations at the same time, and that when you see a shift. I think that's one thing we're trying to do. And then the second thing is to make sure there is a generational healing. So part of what we do is a lot of work on multigenerational. It's not like you guys are irrelevant and we should, take over you. It's more like, how can we co-lead this moment? Because we're going to take over anyway. And so that when we transition, we can build something better and we can be better leaders than you were.
Two questions then. One is, you mentioned an aspiration of the century, or the aspiration of the generation. If you were to articulate it in a few sentences, what would it be? And then the second one, maybe adding on to that, is part of it has to do with power, right? Because we look at it from a generational lens, but to your point about, like, systems are not changing. We're asking for inclusion, but we're asking for inclusion in systems that fundamentally do not work for the type of makeup that we have. There's a point in there at the center about it has to do with power and how we organize power, in that at the end of the day, there will only be one president, there will only be one minister of whatever, there will only be, so even if we're asking for inclusion, if at the end of the day the system is still built that there isn't, I remember listening to someone saying that our ambition is that enough people have a higher education, but there's no scenario where we build enough universities for the 1 billion African youth that are going to be alive in 2100, etc. What would be your big bet in actualizing that aspiration for the future, by challenging some of these dynamics of power and access and elite structures, etc.?
Yeah, I think at least the millennials, I can talk of my generation mission. I was on the streets in Tunis demanding for regime change, and we ended a 23-year dictatorship. And our slogan was شغل حرية كرامة وطنية, jobs, freedom, and dignity. And I think our generation mission has been based on especially financial freedom. And now that I'm taking it to the feminist movement and, the women platform, it's also about financial freedom. We talk about, bodily autonomy and sexual productive health and all these issues. But the essence of it, the foundation of it, if you're not financial free, you have no choice over your own body. You have no choice to get out of gender-based violence. You have no choice of protecting yourself, protecting your community. Again, to your question of power, the financial freedom is your power, to in the political landscape. Because even if you do not have at least a seat at the table, or, a position in the ecosystem that can make you really drive policy change, with your financial freedom, you can still do you, right? You can still drive sustainable initiatives. You can, start your own organization and make some sort of change for your community. So I definitely think for this century, that is the mission. And I think, like, my contribution to actualizing that has always been, the past at least 7, 8 years, is co-leadership, because that is the model I see the future. That is the movements, when movements across Africa organized, for uprisings and revolution, even the recent protest of Gen Z in Kenya, their manifesto, they say we're leaderless, right? But I mean, of course, you need structures, you need to organize yourself in something. You can't just not have a leadership structure. But what they're trying to say is that the current model of leadership doesn't work. The one-man show doesn't work anymore. And we need to be able to create systems that are more inclusive. And women are great at that. Women are collaborative. They're emotionally intelligent. They like to bring people together. They like to nurture some sort of collaboration. But and we know, on the other hand, the masculine way of leading is very much egocentric, right? So I think those are tough conversations we need to have. And it's not about men are not great leaders, but it's about, can men incorporate more feminist values in their leadership? So it can be co-led, it can be co-shared, it can be more inclusive. The consultative process of the United Nations, the African Union, institutions that are built on one type of way of leadership, can they be more collaborative and not extractive of young people voices and expertise and resources? So that's what we're saying, that's co-leadership. You're bringing me to the table from the get-go for us to co-design something, co-write these policies, and co-implement them so we can have ownership over them. But if you bring me to this process to extract from me and not pay me for it, and then come back and do nothing in the community, that is the leadership we need to dismantle right now, which is causing a lot of the issues we're facing.
Youth consultations must fall. That's been like one of my things, is like the next time someone calls me
I love
into a
that.
conference just so I can give my 2 cents and say thank you, I've had enough. I've had, but I think it speaks to what you're saying before about, with political leaders, there's a lot of mobilization that happens of young people for a specific cause. And then it's a thank you very much. You can go back to your life now. I've gotten what I need.
They call it validation workshops. I mean, I advocated to get rid of these validation workshops, because literally it's a ticking box. So after you've done this whole process, you need a validation workshop. Bring, the refugee, the one with disability, the women in rural area, and say, I had a meeting with this and this
Yeah.
and that. We validated this document and we're done. But yeah, to your point, I think what we're trying to advocate for and have been advocating for, and it's our demand 10 of the manifesto, is intergenerational co-leadership. And that does not mean like pass the torch to us. That's mean co-leading now in all of these formats we're discussing. But on a state level, of course, is much more complicated, but it's very much possible. And we've seen young female ministers do it. We have the Minister of Namibia, 27-year-old. We had the Minister of Botswana. She was 29 when she was Minister of Investment, Boholo Kinawendo, and she's now a Member of Parliament, again, appointed after a great change in Botswana. And we have different examples across the continent where, when you give young female leaders a chance at a mayor level, a council level, a ministerial level, they have a different way of leading, and it gives results much faster.
It's interesting you're mentioning Emma, who is the 27-year-old minister you're speaking about. Her point is that we need processes, and we need people who understand processes. In response to the Kenyan youth protest saying we don't have leaders, it was like, yeah, we don't need leaders, we need processes. That's what we need. That's how you go ahead and create that transformation. But as a Gen Z, to add a little bit of complexity to that, is that because we're coming into adulthood around where the climate discussion is alive and kicking, the question of financial freedom, everyone must have jobs, sits at this intersection with the fact that we also know that material growth economic growth based on material means is not feasible. The challenge of financial freedom, knowing that we're having this climate catastrophe coming ahead of us, is such a complex thing that is hard to deal with, because I need my financial freedom. I need my freedoms to be able to contribute to society, as you're saying. But we're also living in an environment where it seems like there's an unspoken discussion of how improbable and how difficult it's going to be. I don't know if you have any insights or any words to share for anyone who holds a similar anxiety that I do when it comes to that particular question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. And again, because when you have financial freedom, you not only able to give back to your community and be more resilient, so you're not waiting for all these processes, complex processes to come to fruition. When, I was at the UN just a couple of weeks ago, and I was telling the cohort of member states that while you are figuring out anything when a crisis happens, like a pandemic or a war, come out, you're still debating for weeks and weeks to pass a resolution. Young people already open pathways to humanitarian intervention. Young people already set up community and donation and fundraising projects to get going. So they have already not only mitigated, but kind of responded to the crisis in the first phase while you all are figuring out. So imagine, and this is with no resources, right? And this is with the 70% of the continent offline with no digital access. So imagine if you give young people of this continent the financial freedom, the digital access that they can have. Not only they can give back, not only they can make an important intervention, but also they have the freedom if the crisis is really, that's it, like they have to move to another country or they're going to be displaced. You still have your financial freedom to start a new life. And we're struggling today to protect women and girls in conflict, in displacement, in migration, because they do not have the financial freedom, to move somewhere else and start a new life. They do not have financial freedom to be a nomadic employee or a freelancer or a consultant, things and structures that still we are fighting for frameworks to exist in our countries to, allow for these jobs to exist, right? So I think, again, even with that gloomy picture of the future, we're not running away for climate change. Whatever we're trying to do to save the earth and mitigate, it's still going to be a lot of catastrophes. It's still going to be a lot of disasters we have to deal with. But I think with financial freedom, we're allowing better livelihoods for this generation and better transfer of that generational wealth for the next generation. Because if we build it with this generation, if we build that basic financial freedom, then the next one will have a much better living conditions. The next one will have much better consciousness, because when you also have financial freedom, you have responsibility, right? And so when you have displacement, when you have disasters, when you have climate crises, you're going to be worried more about your poverty as a first line, because that's your first struggle, rather than what's going on around you, or rather than saving, your country or the world. So I really hear your concerns, and I share them. The future is scary. But I think we should double down on making sure that young people, young women have their financial freedom to make choices for their lives and to make choices for their livelihoods and to make choices for their countries. We've been having discussion at the NalaFem Council, a lot about women political leadership and, how are we strategizing around getting women in masses in politics, right? But you look at the women who go into politics and they're financially, like their campaign budget is zero. They're relying on all of these things to run their campaign. They go there, they're focused on political change. They go out with zero, financial freedom, with zero economic empowerment. And we were at some point asking ourselves, shouldn't we, when we say we want women political leadership, shouldn't we be focusing first on empowering them economically?
It's a complex one. So doubling down into economic freedom. And earlier you also mentioned that like a lot of this work is happening largely unfunded. So where does this economic opportunity potentially come from? I spoke to one of your fellows like a year ago, and she was speaking about how she ran for office, and it was largely crowdfunded. And she was saying, first of all, you're competing in an environment where people are just giving other people cash to vote. Like, hey, here's a few shillings so you can go to the ballot, etc. And but she was saying that she felt when she lost, she did feel a bit like this is people's money that just didn't go anywhere, didn't do anything. Could I have done something more useful with this support that I have? What are the opportunities to get that type of resourcing? Or is your proposal to maybe more people should have a little bit of a career before they go into politics?
What we're trying to breed now as a generation of female leaders is to be Pan-African, right? It's because like you can't just be feminist, you have to be Pan-African. And to go back to the foundation that as a continent with the richest continent in the world, like we have 33% of the global diamond reserve. We have, I don't know, 80% of the arable reserve. The Democratic Republic of Congo can feed the entire continent, and I can go on with the kind of resources we have. We can, as a continent, as countries, be like self-reliant on our own and feeding our own population, building our own economies, and creating our own jobs. Like we can. We have to make sure that this is not a dream. This is not some fantasy, for Africa to realize. Without the help of anybody, we can as a continent. And not only for ourselves, we are nourishing the world's economy, right? And the closest one, Europe. We have been nourishing European economy. On that level, on that scale, there are decisions, there is political will, there are political policies, there is an Africa integration that can play a huge role in fixing this unemployment challenge, in driving the financial freedom challenge. And we have to look at it at macro level, continental level, because it's going to be much faster. And there are a lot of things are into place and going slowly, like the African Free Trade Area, the e-commerce platform, the financial infrastructure and regulations. I moved here in Kenya, Nairobi. I love M-Pesa, and I love how, since I've known M-Pesa for the 10 years, they have been even improving their financial ecosystem further, right? So we cannot talk of us as in our tiny countries and and our tiny jobs in a company somewhere on the southern of Tunis or on the east of Ghana. Like, if we really want to uplift our livelihoods to the level where we deserve all to live as African youth, that's where we should start. Now, in terms of like individual careers, so the fellowship you're talking about, what we're proposing is that whether you want to go into politics or not, you have to have an experience in government. So yes, we're going to work on the financial part. We're going to work on the financial literacy. We're going to work on the training for, career development and whatnot. But whether you want to make change and impact outside the government for your country or inside, you have to understand government. The first thing we need to make sure this generation understand is how you navigate power. Who has power, and is it power over, where are you at that scale, and who are the allies in that power? And I think for us, building that ecosystem of them, for them in terms of power, if you don't feel like you're holding power right now, where does power relies, and how can we give access to that? So that's part of it. It's not one answer. Financial freedom, as I said, is one of them, but they're complex of things, especially for African youth, because they're the most discriminated, the most excluded by age, by gender. It's a reality we live in. And the smallest access you can give to them, so many miracles can happen. And we've seen them in many of the parliamentarians who are now in Kenya's parliament, the young women. Once they had access, they're out there, changing laws and driving progressive agendas. And in many of the countries right now that are facing elections as well. But those parliamentary seats are not enough. You have to maintain them in politics.
So I know we're almost out of time. If I were to ask one last, maybe simple, maybe not simple question, is if you could, at the snap of your fingers, create a little miracle, what would it be?
Ah, Nolita, we need many miracles in this world. The first miracle I want is a ceasefire for the Palestinian people and women and children, but also across conflict settings in Sudan and Congo and so many of our African people as well. But I really like a miracle would be to uphold peace in the world. Let's start there. Another miracle would be to hold perpetrators accountable. Like, I would love to see justice, accountability. It would just heal a lot of the people, a lot of the women who've gone through sexual violence, in conflict, in domestic violence, and whatever violent situation they've been at. It's just like seeing justice is more than 50% of that healing process. And I think even as Africa, we haven't seen justice as a continent to a lot of the atrocities that happen to us. So That would be 2, and then 3 would be equality, for sure. I just want to smash patriarchy and just get over it so I can live my life free and just be.
Yeah, to just, be yourself without having to think too much about too many things. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. And thank you all for listening in. For more information, please visit clubofrome.org.